So especially after hearing that Old Testament reading, but the others too, don't you just kind of wonder sometimes why God doesn't get fed up with people and just walk away? I mean, think about human behavior. For thousands of years, people have been judging each other based on meaningless differences and keeping others away from resources that God has provided and treating each other violently. And then think about our own behavior. I mean, when I get up in the morning and offer morning prayer each day, and the time comes for the confession of sin, I find myself mostly confessing the same things that I confessed the day and the week and the month before. I mean, that may mean that I suffer from a failure of imagination, that's possible, but I don't think that I'm alone in that. So try this sort of thought experiment. How do you take your own path and turn away from what you know God would prefer? Bring a couple of examples to mind. You don't have to share them, don't worry. Okay, so if I asked you that question last week or last month or last year, would you have brought to mind very different examples? I imagine hearing our confessions must be incredibly boring to God because the story really doesn't change that much as time goes on. Well, for the first people of the covenant, the people of Israel, their collective category of sin seems to have been idolatry, in the sense of embracing gods other than Yahweh. Now, sometimes those gods looked a lot like our idols, possessions and privilege and power, but sometimes those idols looked like idols. And today's reading from Exodus, it tells that story. Moses has gone up to Mount Sinai to receive God's law, and we know in the story that he'll be gone 40 days. But the folks back in the camp at the bottom of the mountain, they don't have any idea what's happened to Moses. He's just disappeared. So, with this golden calf, maybe they're just looking for a chance to party. I don't know. But maybe more than a month of silence with Moses up there on the mountain has made them wonder whether Yahweh was really the one who brought them out of slavery after all. Maybe they would think, it was the local deity, which is how people understood divinity in that day, different gods reigning over particular geographies. So they create a representation of a local god, the golden calf. Maybe it's sort of celestial fishing, trying to see whether the god would take the bait. But for whatever reason, they do what people have been doing forever, which is to put the worries of the moment and their own self-interest first. So in the story, God sees this, looks down the mountain and sees this, and goes into a rage. What? It's not enough that I inflicted plagues on your enemies and freed you from slavery and gave you water from a rock and fed you with the bread of angels? You want to worship something else other than me? So God tells Moses to get out of the way while the Lord brings the hammer down. And God assures Moses, don't worry, I'll start the covenant over with you once I consume all of them. But Moses says to God, wait, hold on a minute. And he talks the Almighty out of it. So hit the pause button on the story for a minute. I mean, here is Moses, not exactly a guy with a perfect history, a murderer who has turned down his call from God several times. Here's Moses interceding for these stiff-necked people who are dancing around the golden calf. Now, imagine, if God were speaking to you as directly as to Moses, and if God was going to bring down judgment on everybody but you, would you decide to ally yourself with these people who God was about to consume in righteous anger? It's hard to imagine what Moses was thinking. I don't think Moses was on the side of the rebellious people, per se. I think Moses was on the side of the relationship with God that they'd broken. Because once Moses goes down the mountain after this story, he was just as angry with the people as God had been. It's not a pleasant little account that follows today's reading, that Moses and his supporters kill everybody who had turned against his leadership, and God sends a plague against the ones who remain alive. So clearly there are consequences for turning away from a covenant that you make with God, because keeping the covenant is job one. So anyway, back to the story. Up on the mountain, Moses explains to the Almighty why the plan is wrong. And then comes the only thing maybe more surprising than Moses' response to God, which is God's response to Moses. That God changes God's mind. Okay, hit the pause button one more time. Because isn't God supposed to be omniscient? I mean, at least some Christian traditions would say that God wrote the whole script for existence before the Big Bang ever happened. The God knows all and has worked out everything that's going to come. But here we see God changing God's mind. What's going on with that? Well, maybe for Moses and for God, the answer lies in the importance of honoring commitments. You know, Moses pledged to God that he would bring the people out of slavery to Pharaoh, and now slavery to their temptation to choose the gods they want. And well before that, God pledged to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob to bless them and their descendants with land and abundance. So God and Moses, they're both fully aware that the people have failed utterly by substituting their own solutions for God's. But in a covenant relationship, you're not simply pledging yourself to the stipulations of the deal. That's what a contract is. In a covenant, you're pledging yourself to the other party and committing yourself to walk along together. And that's something we know a little bit about in this tradition. We're kind of familiar with covenants. Every time we celebrate Eucharist here, we remember Jesus' new covenant, which is, I'll give you eternal life if you'll trust and follow me. And every time we celebrate a baptism, we renew our baptismal covenant, pledging to trust in God and pledging to live our lives following Jesus and in loving commitment to God and the people around us. When we get married, we stand here before God and make a covenant with our beloved to invest ourselves in that relationship as long as we both shall live. And when we're ordained, we make a covenant with God and God's people to live out the trust and responsibility of a new order of ministry. So covenants seem to be our pattern of commitment too. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's interesting that what God asks of us is not just our worship or our tithes or our following of the rules. Apparently, what God values most is covenant living, investing ourselves in relationships with God and with each other, even when the other covenant partner doesn't deserve it. Think about second reading. Think about how crazy it is that the most influential follower of Jesus in all Christian history is the Apostle Paul. At the start of his story, at least, Paul even beats Moses as the most unlikely hero, not just telling God no, but hell no. In the second reading we heard today, he describes himself as formerly a persecutor, a blasphemer, and a man of violence, arresting and killing followers of Jesus because they were breaking the religious rules of the day. For having co-opted God's role as judge, Paul was the last person to be giving us a gospel of grace, of divine love freely given. But that is precisely how God asked Paul to change his mind. Now, Paul didn't deserve a second chance any more than the people of Israel. The truth is, neither do we, and our redundant confessions prove it. So, to me at least, here's the good news in this, that God chooses love over the highest holiness score. Think about the gospel reading we just heard. Where God works the hardest is with the one who's lost. Where God works the hardest is in the areas of our lives that are out of alignment with divine purpose. I mean, sure, God appreciates in that parable all the coins that are properly collected and kept nicely where they're supposed to be. And God appreciates the 99 sheep who don't go off on their own paths. But what makes God rejoice is when the lost one is found and comes home. So for us, in our own lives, in our own hearts, what are the relationships that challenge us the most? The ones we might feel justified in letting go? Where do we need to consider changing our minds? Maybe it is sticking with someone we'd sooner leave behind. Or maybe it's entertaining the possibility that there might be some truth, even some holiness, in the other side's point of view, whatever that is. Or maybe it's remembering that being in relationship is what makes all people grow into the full stature of Christ, both them and us. When we ask ourselves those hard questions, and when we do the work to strengthen the covenants that challenge us most, we gain something. And I think it's the last thing we would expect. It's peace. In the upside-down reality of the kingdom of Jesus Christ, we find that committing ourselves to hard relationships brings joy, strange as it sounds. We are blessed with being stuck with people we find it hard to love. And we are liberated from judgment when we bind ourselves to God's grace. So in those moments, when we think that we know best, when the world tells us that we are completely within our rights to walk away from the people we're bound to, or maybe even punish them for their sins, that's when God says, wait. Grace beats judgment, even when judgment seems deserved, even when judgment seems righteous. After all, God says, even I changed my mind